All right, friends, go ahead and pull out your business ethics in action texts. We're going to talk a little bit about marketing ethics. Let me say some opening comments about marketing ethics. I probably have a lot of marketing majors here this morning. Raise your hand, marketing major. Just one? Two? All right. Marketing is a real popular major here at HBU, and it's an increasingly popular area of business. A lot of people go into marketing because they have an artsy side. They want to be able to express that. A lot of people go into marketing because they want to be able to make money but avoid statistics and math, which you can do by staying away from accounting. Marketing ethics in general has a pretty, marketing has pretty bad ethical reputation. The reason why is because a lot of people in the general culture perceive much of marketing to be deception. Okay, that's the general perception. Now, I don't necessarily think that perception is accurate, but certainly there are a lot of cases of companies that market their products by means of bait and switch tactics, where a sort of a promise of some offer is given, and then once customers move further in pursuing that offer, it turns out it's not nearly as good as they thought it was, and a lot of the hype surrounding the offer was actually just deception. Okay, and marketing has a bad ethical reputation because it's been abused primarily in that particular way. If you open up your business ethics in action text to the marketing ethics chapter, starting on page 271, we're going to cover two topics today, primarily in our lecture. We're going to cover the topic of disclosure, expectations, and requirements in marketing ethics. In other words, how much should be disclosed about the product, how much should be disclosed about things that could go wrong with the product. Okay, what are standards of expectations that we should follow in pursuing appropriate disclosure? And then the second topic that we're going to cover today is the topic of surveillance marketing, which has really blown up into an enormous topic in our era of social media. And we'll cover that primarily through a case study. Okay, but if you look at this Mattel case on page 271, open up your text, please, and follow along with me. Just a quick question for you all. What was Mattel doing, and why was this a controversial case? Mattel is a company that makes what kinds of things? Children's toys, yes? Very famous toy company. Okay, they're responsible for a bunch of famous toy lines, including Fisher-Price, Barbie, which is by far the most famous Mattel toy line. Okay, but also American Girl, Hot Wheels, the Matchbox cars, things like that. Okay, why did Mattel get in trouble? Toy safety problems, exactly, yeah. That's absolutely right. Okay, so they had to recall a bunch of products. Children were getting injured playing with the toys. Bits of toys were coming off and children were popping them in their mouths and things like that. It was an unfortunate case. Now, when I read this case as the parent of 3 children, 5 and under, I can honestly say that, like, my first take on this is children abuse their toys really heavily. My 1-year-old thinks that everything goes in her mouth. That it's just like, it's just like dogs that way. At any rate, though, Mattel, in this particular instance, does appear to have made their toys to substandard quality. Okay, so if you've got a customer base that does abuse the toys, then you need to make the toys a little bit sturdier, and Mattel apparently didn't do that. Now, they initially blamed China, where the toys were assembled, and said that the Chinese manufacturers who they were contracting with did not make the toys up to proper specifications, but the Chinese were able to prove that this was in fact wrong, and Mattel eventually took the blame and issued recalls and also had to face a lot of negative publicity and lost money as a result, lost sales, and I think they may have faced, let me look at this again, they may have faced some fines as well. Okay, this is an interesting case because it touches on the subject of how much should be disclosed when it comes to potential risks and dangers in products. Okay, and to be honest, a lot of marketing is presenting the best side of a product, talking to the customer about the best way to use the product or the best ideal thing that the product can do, to cast a vision, as it were. Now, when we try to sell something or when we try to persuade others of something, maybe the correctness of our position on a particular topic, or we try to sell them a particular thing that we want them to do, it's common for us as human beings just to present the best side, okay, and not to present the potential downside. And I think this is a perfectly defensible thing to do. Okay, so one thing I want to get across in this marketing ethics module is that marketing is an honorable calling. Okay, and it is an honorable calling because I think primarily at the heart of capitalist marketing as a model is information exchange. Now, some of that can be manipulative, and I want to clearly point out ways in which marketing can be manipulative and cross certain ethical red lines. But at the same time, I think that marketing is an honorable calling, and I think that it is certainly defensible for people to go into it and to do wonderful things in the world of marketing. But at the same time, a lot of marketing is persuasion using the best side of the case, okay, or making points about the ideal things that the product can do. Now, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong or deceptive about primarily focusing on the good about the product, okay? Especially if when the customer asks or makes inquiries, you are willing to talk about downsides or potential dangers of the product, okay? If you are evasive as a marketer when customers make further inquiries about potential problems or downsides of products, that's a problem. Like that's when you can cross over into deception. But you aren't obligated to disclose all the possible things that could go wrong with the products when you are initially marketing it. Okay. Part of that is because I think that customers should be treated as adults and should be able to make appropriate, they should be given space to make appropriate inquiries on their own and appropriate due diligence to ascertain whether this product is indeed likely to operate as advertised. If you look on page 276, there's kind of a spectrum here. And on one side of the spectrum is the view that marketing disclosure doesn't have to be very great at all. You don't have to talk very much at all about things that could go wrong with the product or ways in which the product might not perform to expectations. And on the other side, there is the view that you have to disclose everything. Okay, so at the bottom of page 276, the consumer sovereignty view. Consumer sovereignty argues that clients and consumers are solely responsible for their own decisions and that the marketer has no responsibility whatsoever for their purchases. This approach leads managers to organize marketing with consumer desire and, of course, profitability as the only criteria. This approach stresses respect for the freedom and autonomy of consumers, which is a consumer right. Okay, so this approach at one extreme is really big on consumer freedom, consumer sovereignty, but probably underestimates the extent to which businesses ought to take responsibility for disclosing things that could happen with their products. On the other side is the paternalism view, and I'll read from the text here. At the opposite extreme of consumer sovereignty is the position of paternalism. The idea that the manufacturer and seller are the only ones with sufficient information to make the right decisions. Okay, and if you actually turn the page and look at the little box on page 279, there are two Latin terms that are very famous in the world of marketing and that nicely capture the two different sides of this. One is caveat emptor, and the other is caveat vendettor. And these are two different systems or approaches to marketing ethics and to disclosure expectations. Okay, they literally are Latin terms that just mean buyer beware, caveat emptor, and seller beware, caveat venditor. In other words, responsibility is on the buyer under caveat emptor, and responsibility is on the seller under caveat venditor. These are two different systems with different expectations about the party, which is primarily responsible for the information and for obtaining the information or providing the information in the product exchange. Okay, caveat emptor, buyer beware, is the system that was dominant in the United States from almost the founding up until the mid-20th century. Okay, so when you think about the history of marketing, caveat emptor, buyer beware, is a system that is without a doubt dominant throughout the country up until maybe the 1960s or so. Now, there has been a shift, primarily due to high-profile lawsuits and litigation involving product failures, that has made American capitalism trend very much in this direction. And I would say nowadays, caveat venditor, seller beware, is the dominant position in most fields, most industries in the United States. So let me describe some of the strengths and weaknesses of these different views. And I'm going to start with a caveat emptor situation, and we can talk a little bit about the things that this sort of a model does well and the things that it does poorly. So imagine with me a marketing ethics scenario happening in an era of almost no government regulation, where things are wide open and there's very little regulatory oversight. Okay, so let's imagine a mid-19th century, late 19th century, let's say, a Western American town on the frontier. Okay, and you are a townsperson. There's very little government oversight in a situation like that. Maybe the sheriff, and that's it. Sheriff's got one deputy. You are a townsperson going about your normal everyday farming business, and I come into town and I sell medical products. Okay, I ride in with my horse and wagon, and I have special deals for people. Okay, I sell oils and ointments that can treat all sorts of problems. Okay, and I sell you some oil to help treat some eczema that you've been dealing with. Okay, you apply the oil. The next morning you wake up, your skin is green. Okay, and it's clearly something's gone wrong in the product exchange and in the disclosure that I provided. Okay, so you run over to the other side of town where I was staying at the hotel to find me, and I have skipped town in the middle of the night, and I am no longer there. And you now have little to no recourse to go after me for the product malfunctioning. Okay, you have had personal injury that has occurred, and yet I, the defendant in a case like potential litigation case like this, am not present. You could organize a posse to come after me. That takes, takes some convincing of other people to do. You could try to wire to the next town, wherever I might be headed, to see if you could stop me. But there's not really all that much you can do in a scenario like that. Certainly not like today, where there's much heavier regulatory oversight, and you can pretty clearly, litigate in circumstances of the kind that I described. So a caveat emptor system, buyer beware, has some serious weaknesses, as evidenced by this example I've given. One such weakness is that in a caveat emptor system, there are few or no potential litigation responses to protect consumers. Okay, so consumer protection by the court system is minimal. And I'm going to be talking about the strengths and weaknesses of these two systems, caveat emptor and caveat venditor, from the perspective of the consumer. Okay? So I should just dispose that now. Legal protection is minimal. You have very little recourse in a circumstance like what I described, other than to pursue some vigilante justice by chasing me down with a posse. Okay, now that's a problem. And it's because of the lack of litigation opportunities that we have moved in recent years, since the 1960s, 1970s, toward a caveat vendettor system because of high-profile cases where products malfunctioned, harmed, killed people, and people couldn't do anything about it. Okay, courts began ruling in the favor of customers. But at the same time, there are certain strengths to the caveat emptor system. Let's actually think this through intuitively. In the absence of substantial legal protection and substantial regulatory oversight, what might be a strength of a caveat emptor system? Would the products be, from the perspective of a customer, I should say, would the products be more expensive or less expensive? Cheaper products, yeah, for sure. It's really expensive for companies to maintain a litigation protection department where they pay a stable of lawyers all the time to protect them against potential lawsuits. Okay, it's really expensive for companies to do beta, gamma, delta testing rounds on their products to make sure that the products aren't always as, aren't dangerous. Products are much cheaper when the buyer is the one who is expected to inform himself or herself of the nature of the product. And it's not on the seller to ensure that the buyer is protected. Okay, the legal burden of proof, as it were, is not on the seller. Okay, another strength of a caveat emptor system is there tends to be greater corporate innovation. When companies can get litigated against because of product malfunction, they tend to be cautious in the way that they, just develop and innovate and create. But when they aren't likely to face much litigation or even no litigation at all, there is much greater opportunity and much more incentive because of the monetary incentive for them to create and to invent. Okay, so a caveat vendettor system, by the way, the strengths and weaknesses of this system are just the opposites of the caveat emptor system. But in a caveat vendettor system, you tend to see a suppression of innovation because companies are cautious. They don't want to face litigation. So the strength of such a system is strong legal protection for consumers. And an example of weakness is more expensive products, because the costs of all those other rounds of testing that companies have to do to ensure that the products are likely to perform as advertised gets ultimately borne by the consumer. Okay, and there's less innovation on a caveat vendettor system as well. Going back to the caveat emptor system, are there any other major weaknesses that we can point to in such a system? What might be other weaknesses? Absence of legal protections is a pretty big weakness from the perspective of a customer. Other weaknesses? Or strengths? You guys can think of other strengths. You can list those as well. Look at the box with me for a minute. Consumer sovereignty often shares the view of the classic Latin aphorism, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. This motto has been used in commerce to claim that a buyer should not expect compensation for defects in a purchase that is unfit for its ordinary purpose. There is no warranty. The buyer takes the risk. In accordance with the caveat emptor principle, the seller should only warn of substantial latent defects in the product, but not of anything else that might discourage a purchase decision. Okay, so one weakness of this system is it tends to lead to much more cautious consumers. Okay, maybe that's a weakness. It could, I suppose, be interpreted as a strength. But it leads to, from the perspective of wanting to promote commerce, it's a weakness. When consumers are really cautious, they're not going to buy much. Okay, and commerce won't flow as freely in such a system. Okay, on the flip side, in such a system, consumers are expected to do their own due diligence. When you are looking at a marketing ethics system that's built on the principle of seller beware rather than buyer beware, people come to think that their purchasing choices are guaranteed or protected, and they don't have to do much due diligence. Okay, so this kind of a system, a caveat emptor system, promotes due diligence on the part of consumers, and that, I suppose, is the flip side of the cautious consumers' weakness. When I purchase products, I generally devote an amount of time to the purchase process that is commensurate with the cost of the product. Okay, so if the product is going to cost me more than $100, I probably spend a little bit of time thinking about it and looking at my options. But if the product is going to cost me $20, I spend very little time at all comparing my options, usually assuming that all options are alike or there isn't much variation in the options or something like that. Okay, and I do that primarily because we are operating these days under a caveat vendettor system where there are substantial litigation protections for consumers and substantial expectations that vendors will bear the responsibility for the various different disclosures and testing requirements that we have these days. My lack of due diligence for most products is a function of us being in this system these days. But in this system, consumers don't have any protection or very little protection, and so the amount of due diligence that they would have to do themselves would have to be very substantial. They'd have to, undertake a lot of research. Okay, and so it would take more consumer time to make purchases under this kind of a system. Okay, on the other hand, it could be argued that it's good for consumers to be expected to exercise their due diligence. If you think that you're always going to be protected, then you're not going to spend a lot of time looking at the reliability histories of products that you're considering. And so the flip side of the greater amount of consumer time that it would take in a caveat emptor system is that some would argue that it's good for consumers actually to be more informed about the products that they're purchasing than most are these days. Okay, and if you look at the rest of this box, today, considering the asymmetry in information between the seller and the customer with many products, an attitude of caveat emptor seems insufficient. So like I said, there has been a shift in the legal system towards caveat vendettor in America. The alternative is caveat vendettor, that is, let the seller beware, underlining the need for the seller to be held accountable and to take responsibility for the product beyond what is evident or can easily be discovered by the buyer. Okay, and one more sentence. This requires selling products of a reasonable quality and giving ample information so as to facilitate an informed decision. Are there any comments or reflections on the variations between these two systems or approaches to marketing disclosures and expectations, caveat emptor and caveat vendettor? I have a question for you guys. Given the strengths and weaknesses listed here and the fact that the strengths and weaknesses of this system are basically the flip side of these, basically the opposite, which system would you rather live under? Would you rather live under a system with strong consumer protections or with weaker consumer protections? Strong consumer protections. Others? Yeah.
Stronger. I'd rather have.
Stronger consumer protections. Okay, good. Can someone make the case for the caveat vendettor system, the one with stronger consumer protections? What's the decisive factor here that, I've had a couple votes in favor of that. What's the decisive factor for those of you who would prefer that system? Is it peace of mind?
I consume more than what I would produce.
Consume more than you produce, so you'd rather live under a system that gives you as a consumer litigation protection. Okay, that's powerful. I like that. Anybody else? Oh, go ahead.
From an ethics standpoint, I mean, stronger consumer protection probably leads to less like what is it called? Like manipulation in the other one. Like if they were open about all the side effects they knew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, companies knowing that they can't get away with stuff are gonna try far fewer deceptive tactics. That's true.
I just think the quality of like the product would be a lot better, and
Mm-hmm.
if you have more consumer protection,
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like without it, you can, like companies can find a lot of loopholes and get around, like make really cheap product.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, you can imagine the products that we think that a lot of stuff that comes out of China these days is cheaply made, but imagine how cheaply it would be made if we didn't have the litigation protections that we have. Interesting. See, actually, maybe I'm the only one in the room. My intuition would be completely the opposite. I would prefer this system to that system because I guess I think that I can protect myself. Now, maybe that's risky, but I would get a lot cheaper products. Like, things would be less expensive. And I generally tend to do more due diligence when it comes to purchases than most people do. And so I guess that would be. On the other hand, if you're a seller, you almost certainly would favor this. Like if you're a company, like this is a much easier system to operate under if you're a company. But I would say most people these days share you guys' view about it being better to have a system of strong consumer protection. And certainly there are many points to be made in favor of that system, and I can see the value of it, although I myself tend to be a gambler and would prefer the caveat emptor system with the cheaper products. Okay, let us switch points now.